Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. First, a short introduction to the webinar and the subject of this afternoon, and Eurosite. Eurosite's mission is to improve the management of protected areas by sharing knowledge and experiences. And Eurosite is an organization that brings together site managers and those interested in site management from across Europe. And this webinar is part of a variety of trainings, meetings, workshops, and field visits connected to Eurosite's mission. This specific workshop is organized by the Eurosite Management Planning Expert Group, EMPEG, and the Management Expert Group is also responsible for the Management Planning Toolkit. That is an online support tool for management and management planning of protected areas, which you can find on the Eurosite website. This toolkit is a work in progress, and we hope to be able to include soon up-to-date information about peatland management and peatland restoration. Eurosite is also a proud partner of the Interact Care Peat project, which aims to restore the carbon storage capacity of different types of peatlands by setting up and demonstrating innovative technologies for peatland restoration and carbon measurements. A special welcome to our two guest speakers, Alistair Lockett, who is Senior Field Officer of the Pennine Peat Life project in England, an upland peatland area, and Robert Duff, who is Project Manager of the Marshes Mosses Bog Life project on the border between Wales and England, and is a lowland peatland project. In view of the ongoing climate crisis, it is needless to say that there is an urgent need to step up the pace of peatland restoration. Although peatland restoration projects are implemented for at least 50 years, it is only since about the last 20 years that peatland restoration projects are viewed as a crucial element in combating climate change. Since 1992, the LIFE program has supported the restoration of about 48,000 hectares of peatlands. Were these projects in the beginning funded from the LIFE Nature program, it is only since 2014 that peatland restoration is also financed through the LIFE Climate Action Program. And in addition to the LIFE projects, drained peatlands have been restored through Interact projects and through national funding schemes. Recently, two important peatland-related projects had their final conferences, and these projects produce relevant information about, for instance, the impact of rewetting on CO2 emissions. It is estimated that the remaining 50 million hectares of drained peatlands worldwide are responsible for an estimated 1,000 megaton of CO2, which is equal to about 5.6% of the total human-induced CO2. For Europe, it is estimated that the drained peatlands emit around 220 megatons, which is equal to about 5% of the total greenhouse gas emissions in Europe. In the Netherlands, about 240,000 hectares of lowland peatlands are still drained for agriculture and is the source of huge amounts of CO2. Far too little is done to stop CO2 emissions from drained peatlands. To achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions, peatlands should be turned into CO2 sinks by 2050. There are various reasons why not enough is being done, and land ownership is one of them, and the question how to compensate farmers which are now farming on these drained peatlands. Another reason is the limited amounts of finances available. Lithuania provides an example on how this funding problem can be tackled. Lithuania is one of the countries in Europe with a vast area of drained peatlands. But Lithuania is, as far as I know, also the only country to have included the rewetting of drained peatlands in the Recovery and Resilience Facility program submitted to the European Union. More countries should have followed this example. To boost peatland restoration efforts in Europe, the European Peatland Initiative will be launched in the coming days at COP26 in Glasgow. The European Peatland Initiative is linked to the Global Peatland Initiative headed by the UN Environmental Program. And Eurosite is one of the organizations involved in this European Peatland Initiative. A lot of questions remain to be answered when it comes to the future of peatlands, not the least the question, what will be the future use of the re-wetted peatland areas, especially in Northwestern Europe, which are now mainly used for dairy farming. Polyculture looks to offer promising alternatives, but a lot needs to be further developed when it comes to the choice for the right crops, the harvesting of these crops, the processing, and the use. Exchange on the successes and failures of peatland restoration techniques between all those involved in peatland restoration is essential. We need to learn about the techniques that are effective and efficient. And I'm sure that our speakers will show some inspiring approaches. So I'm happy to hand over the screen to Alistair, who will introduce us into the Pennine Peatland Project Restoration Project. Alistair, the floor is yours.
Thank you. You might just need to figure out the options to allow me to start sharing my screen. There you go. So hopefully everyone can hear me. So my name is Alistair Lockett. I'm a senior field officer for the North Pennines A1B partnership. I'll be going through techniques that we've used through a project called Pennine Peat Life, and they're kind of interchangeable across upland and lowland sites as well. So the techniques have been used and developed through the Pennine Peat Life project. This is a landscape scale project in partnership with Yorkshire Wildlife Trust and Forest of Bowland AONB. The project is funded by the EU Life Program, the Environment Agency, Northumbrian Water, United Utilities and Yorkshire Water. So the project covers 4 protected landscapes in the north of England. So we have the North Pennines AONB in red, we have the Forest of Bowland AONB in purple, Nidderdale AONB in green, and then the Yorkshire Dales National Park in yellow. So the objectives are all about restoring peatlands, developing private market through the Peatland Code, using drones to monitor restoration efforts, and of course dissemination. So I work for the North Pennines AONB, so that stands for Area of Outstanding Natural Beauty. It's located in the north of England, between kind of to the north, it's Northumberland National Park, and to the south, it's the Yorkshire Dales National Park. So it's quite a big chunk of protected landscape. It's just over 2,000 square kilometres, and the partnership is similar to a protected landscape such as a national park. It's made up of statutory agencies such as the Environment Agency and Natural England, local authorities. So we're part of Durham County Council, and we have 4 other local authorities on the partnership. Non-government organisations such as the Wildlife Trust and RSPB, and then voluntary and community organisations as well. So I think in total there's about 26 that make up the partnership. So we don't own any land, and all we can do is, for nature recovery work, we negotiate and work with stakeholders on the ground, normally private individuals, to carry out work. So this is a picture of the AONB, and in purple we've got the blanket bog and upland heath layer. So you can see a big proportion of the AONB is peat, mostly blanket bog, and then on the fringes we've got kind of a shallower peaty soils and heathland. approximately 90% of these peatlands are privately owned, and they're managed predominantly for driven grouse shooting and livestock grazing, both mainly sheep, but also some cattle in there as well. And all of our sites are classed as upland sites, so they range from maybe 400 to 700 meters above sea level. So the Peatland Program, so the A1B partnership does lots of work, including peat. They do hay meadow restoration, they do rivers, mine water remediation, those sort of things, woodland planting. So the Peatland Program has four main objectives. So these these have been around since we started about 15 years ago in 2006. So these are restoration, research, celebration, and promoting best practice. So in terms of bare peat sites, this is quite a typical one for the North Pennines. So we have quite a degraded area of peat hags. There's eroding gullies running through it, and some of these can be, up to 2.5, 3 meters deep. And then we have small areas of vegetation, either on the hag tops or maybe in the bottoms, kind of in the flats where the sphagnum has been allowed to colonize. Another example here, again, kind of this area is all kind of peat hags with fairly substantial water channels running down it, and then we also have flat bare peat areas. And then around it, actually, we have relatively good blanket bogs. So here in this corner and here, we normally have relatively good, wet, sphagnum-rich blanket bog. And then there is just an area of bare peat and damaged eroding peat. So to restore these areas, we started restoration, bare peat restoration in 2010, and we had some slow years, we had some failures as well. And then looking around, we've adapted the techniques used by others in England, and but also further afield. And we came up with a 5-step process to bare peat restoration. So I'm not going to cover all these today. But if anyone wants any more information, there's information on our website, but also you can contact me. But basically there's hydrology, so slowing that flow of water and raising that water table and slowing the water table, which I'll talk a bit about today. Slopes, so that's reprofiling of hag edges. We have heather brash, so we cover all of our bare peat with a mulch of heather brash, so kind of cut moorland vegetation that protects the surface from frost heave. Promoting vegetation growth, so this relates to lime seed and fertilizer that we add on in the first year. And then also the next stage is sphagnum re-establishment if required. So the main things I'm going to cover today are mainly involving excavators that can be kind of swapped and changed between upland and lowland situations. So initially, the Peatland Program started by blocking grips. So grips are what we call drains. So these were cut into the peat after World War II. And landowners were paid to cut these drains by the government. And this was to drain the peatlands and make them more productive for livestock grazing after the war. It didn't take very long for them to realise that this wasn't especially a good idea, and it wasn't very effective at draining the peatlands, and it caused quite a lot of other issues, including carbon emissions, increased flooding, and water colour increases as well. So over the past 15 years, we've worked with stakeholders blocking these ditches up, these drains up. And the way we do that, so on the left-hand side, we have an active grip. So these grips are normally, were initially 0.5 metre deep and less than 0.5 metre wide, and normally cutting across the hill to capture the water flowing down the slope. And what we do is take our contractors will take excavators, and every 6 to 10 meters they will put peat plugs in. And so on the right hand side, this is a block grip with a peat dam here, and this is where we've taken the peat to build the peat dam. So it creates a nice little pool that's really quite good for insect life, and also drinking opportunities for birds. This is quite a cheap method. It doesn't require any external materials, and also it's very, very effective. So this is an aerial shot. So on the left-hand side, we've got open grips, and then on the right-hand side, we have grips that have been blocked. So these dark black marks on the right-hand side, they're actually pools that have been created. So I've got a little video to show you of, this was kind of taken from YouTube from one of our colleagues, Abby Manzi, she used to work at the Northumberland National Park. So basically the key to peat dams is making sure you have a good solid peat dam. So you'll see there that the digger driver is taking up the bottom, the peat at the bottom of the drain that will be cracked, it will be dry, because these drains aren't wet all the time. Like in the summer, they can be quite dry. So the digger driver will be turning that over to avoid those cracks and smash it down to avoid those cracks. They take peat from upslope of the dam, from within the drain, and build it up so that it's approximately, the peat is approximately 30 centimeters above the surface of the bog. So this allows for shrinkage, and then they take the turfs that are around and cover all of the bare peat up so that it's not exposed to the weather. It has little opportunity to dry out, and it will remain quite nice and vegetated. So we've probably installed, you know, we in terms of grips, we've probably be maybe like 60 or 70,000 kilometers of grips that have been blocked in this way. So a huge effort. Yeah, we're up to a point now where we're actually running out of grips, which is fantastic. And those peat dams, it will raise the water table of the peatlands. It will promote sphagnum growth. It will stabilize those water table as well. So make the peatlands a lot more resilient to climate change. Very similar technique, but used slightly differently, are peat dams that we're starting to put into areas of eroding and degraded peatlands and haggy peatlands like this. And this also, so these really big gullies, our aim is to slow the flow of water and also raise the water table. So in this sort of instance, it would be, you know, maybe 1.5 to 2 meters deep. So we would build a series of trickle dams, say maybe 0.5 meter up, so that water is slowed, and then eventually that should colonize with kind of the wetter species of sphagnum. And so this is what they look like when they've been done. So the gully is reprofiled either side, and then peat dams. They look very, very natural, and these are easy to cross for people and livestock as well. They can range from a number of sizes, so these are quite big ones. So this is probably maybe 12 to 40 meters across, and you can see the amount of water that's holding back is relatively shallow, and you can see that the pool further down, you can see the grasses within that. So it is quite a relatively shallow pool, but what it would do is maintain that water level so that the wetter loving species will start growing. There has been some failures with these peat dams. So we've got one here that has blown on the left-hand side, and the dam has failed. And then one here as well. That again, the dam has failed and the water has forced its way through and spilled out. So the key things to remember here. So two reasons why those failed. Number one was the dams were not keyed into the side of the drain, so that's quite key. And then also kind of underestimating the amount of water that these bunds and dams would hold back. So we had to bring the space in a lot closer together to counter that, the kind of the force and the weight of water, and start much further up the hill, putting these peat dams in or other interventions as we get further and further down the hill. And these seem to be holding up really well. Another technique, kind of similar to that, but it's being called peat bunding, which is so we call the dams anywhere where there's a flow of water, or in a vegetated area, and there's no obvious sign of flow of water, then we call that a bund. So it was a really ambitious recent project that was completed. I think it was completed in March 2021. So this wasn't kind of the North Pennines A1B partnership, but just another example from another part of England. It was the National Trust, the Holcombe Moor Commoners Association, it was Moors for the Future Partnership, the Environment Agency, and Natural England. It was funded by DEFRA. So there's a rather large peat blanket bog above Manchester, kind of in a bit south from us, and it was mainly vegetated. I think I've got another picture here. No, mainly vegetated, but it was lacking a moss layer, and also kind of any sort of form of moss layer. And with coring, they found that it didn't have any acrotelm, so there was no active area, kind of section of the bog. There was just a catatelm, and then on top it was mainly dominated by cotton grasses and Molinia. So peat bunds were created and installed across the moor. So a number of reasons: to slow the flow of water, stabilise the hydrology and hold water on the landscape for longer, and also raising the water table to promote sphagnum growth. So these bunds vary between 10 and 16 metres long, and were formed directly with the peat directly upslope of where the bund is. So where that water is on the photo, that's where they've taken the peat. Again, these are quite shallow, and these are already starting to colonise with common cotton grass and should form quite nice pools. So this is an aerial footage, and this is on Google as well. So if you type in Holcombe Moor on Google Maps, and you'll be able to see the scale of what's been done. It's quite impressive. So over 3,500 peat bunds have been installed, and lots of monitoring is going on this site as well. So with the monitoring the water table before and after, using automated dip wells and also manual dip wells, and then also doing vegetation coverage as well. So yeah, initial signs it's very, very promising in terms of slowing the flow of water and raising the water table. They've also actively planted sphagnum in these areas that are doing really well as well. So next up is Hagrid Profiling. So we have a lot of this in Northern England, where we have a peat edge or a peat hag that has come off the peat or has been eroded out. So it's either down to mineral soil or very thin peaty soils. And what happens is we've got this drip edge that continues to erode. We have livestock getting underneath, and you can see a bit of wool on the picture on the left, where livestock will get in and rub and have and cause erosion through there. And then also some of the edges will have active water channels running at the base of them. So again, further erosion. And what happens is these edges will just continue to get eaten away and move further and further back up the hill. So we use excavators again. So we reprofile these slopes. So this is a before and after picture of the same edge. Obviously left is before and right is after. So the digger can sit either on top of the peat hag or at the base of it. So this one's been reprofiled. So this would have been a vertical edge. And the hope is that the vegetation will start colonizing from the base of the slope. And also it allows, it kind of moves the water away from erosion, from eroding that edge. And it also prevents livestock from continuing to rub along that edge as well. So the excavators, this one is a 7 or 8 tonner with a 4-foot bucket on 800 mil pads. Whereas depending on the access, the contractors are sometimes using much bigger machines like 13-ton diggers with 1.2 meter pads. So you can so the ground pressure is still quite low, but you've got a bigger reach and the productivity is much higher with a bigger digger. So in some certain circumstances as well, depending on what's around the edge, they can be returfed as well. So in this picture, there is still a little bit of black on the bottom of the edge, and this would have brash spread on it, or maybe some plug plants. If it allows, then we sometimes take turfs from around about the edge. So this edge has completely been turfed over, and it's kind of that instant hit of revegetation. And this is the area so the edge would be on the left-hand side here, and this is the area where the turfs have been taken from. So those turfs are taken from the bottom half or the lower end of the lower kind of the bottom of the hag, so that it's closer to the water table. The turfs are taken and then they're stitched back together, and the existing turf that's left is stretched so that very little bare peat is left at the end of it. And by taking the turfs from the bottom also means that because it's closer to the water table, they're much more likely to revegetate, and it prevents them from drying out and becoming another issue, really. And this is a final video of how the diggers would reprofile an edge, if I can get it to work. No, it doesn't seem to be working, that one. So apologies for that, but examples of this can be found on our website. We also have the North Pennines YouTube channel and also the Yorkshire Peat Partnership's Vimeo account, which are both really good resources to have a look at some restoration videos. And then through the Pennine Peat Live project, we've done quite a lot of different webinars as well, one on restoration. So if you want more information, they're all recorded and they're all on the website as well. So feel free to go and watch that, or get in touch with me via email. It's all fine too. And that's me done. Thank you.
Thank you, Alistair. It was a great presentation and impressive work you're doing there, especially with this Hagrid profiling. So we're not going to answer the questions that have been put in the Q&A at this moment. We do that after the presentation of Robert. So please, if you have questions, fill them in the Q&A. And so I would like to hand over the screen, so to say, to Robert, who will take us to the border between Wales and England and show us the experiences from his project, which is mainly a lowland peatland area. So Robert, up to you now, and the screen is yours.
Thank you, Hank, and for the invitation to participate in this workshop. My name is Robert Duff. I'm project manager for the Marches Mosses Bog Life project. In my presentation, I'm aiming to provide an overview of the techniques and approaches applied over 3 decades to improve and revive the bog and lag habitat as on a lowland example of a lowland raised bog. Some of it will probably be quite conventional, but some of it may be less familiar. Much of the work I'm going to talk about has been carried out under the direction of colleagues, especially Dr. Joan Daniels and more recently Pete Bowyer, who were the recent site managers for this site I'm going to talk about. Attempts to restore large, heavily degraded peatland sites have been underway for about 30 years in the UK, and the techniques and approaches adopted have had to evolve and develop iteratively, often based on a trial and error approach. And of course, every site and situation is unique and different and needs to be approached on its own merits. So I'm going to try, if time allows, I'm going to sort of give you some context on the site I'm going to talk about to explain the management choices, talk about some of the work that's been carried out to the larger arterial drains, talk about the application of peat bunding, which you've already heard about, but perhaps applied in a lowland context, and look at some of the efforts to revert woodland back to bog habitat. And lastly, if time allows, I'm going to talk about some of the difficult work that we're trying to do to restore the bog edge habitats in close proximity to where people live and other land uses. Okay, so the site is called the Marches Mosses. Marches, for anybody who's interested, means border, and it's the name. It's the name for a single site, which the long name is Fens, Wixel, Bettisfield, Cadney, and Wem Mosses. Although it's got so many names in it, it is essentially one lowland raised bog. It's approximately 1,000 hectares. It's a Natura 2000 SAC, and it straddles the English-Welsh border between the county of Shropshire and Wrexham. 2/3 of the site lies in Wales, and just if anybody wants to get their bearings, it's approximately 90 kilometres south of Liverpool. It's also a Ramsar wetland site, and there are 2 national nature reserves which sit within the site. Natural England, who I work for, England's statutory nature conservation body, manages the site by arrangement with our partner organisation, Natural Resources Wales. Shropshire Wildlife Trust manage the southernmost moss called Wem Moss, you can see in the foreground of the picture. The average rainfall is about 780 millimetres per year, so is relatively low compared to many other UK bogs. So this is quite important, a factor to take into account in the management decisions. So sadly, the site has a familiar history of many of our peatlands. It was enclosed in the early 1800s, meaning that private legal land rights were distributed across the whole moss to over 150 different landowners. And as a result of this, it was progressively drained as the Industrial Revolution took hold. On the north side, a railway was cut across the moss, and out in the south, a canal bisects part of the bog. Peat cutting increased in intensity by the and by the late 1980s, there was a threatened large increase in commercial scale cutting, and this led to a local campaign to save the site for conservation. And it was acquired by the Nature Conservancy Council in 1990, and thereafter became a national nature reserve. Not surprisingly, the greatest challenge is dealing with the impact of 200 years of drainage work by the owners, connected with the commercial and more local hand cutting, and on the edges, the agricultural and forestry impact. So the site has, in the core, is very, there's estimated to be a drain cut every 10 meters. The effect of this has been to dewater the mosses, collapsing the groundwater mound and causing oxidation of the peat to occur with great quantities of CO2 released. It's estimated that the original central dome height in the center was 8 to 10 meters above the surface of the clay and sand. It's now only 2 or 3 meters high, and of course the peat is very disrupted and truncated. But despite all this damage, the site retains an average peat depth of about 3 meters, and it's underlain by clay in the southwest and sand in the northeast. In many of the older hand-cut areas, fortunately, characteristic bog flora and fauna has managed to hang on, and our aim is to try and provide conditions to allow these vestiges of the raised bog vegetation to once again spread across the restored areas. So to give you an idea of how disrupted and damaged the bog is, compare this idealized image of a pristine raised bog dome with its classic ellipse curvature with this 3D image of the peat cutting topography of the mosses, where large trough lies in the middle of the moss where once there was a dome, and multiple small peat hills, so to speak, occur. Fixing the hydrology to optimize the functioning of the bog, i.e. the water table within 10 centimeters of the surface, is complex and not straightforward, and of course is going to take a very long time, if not centuries, to take place. Just blocking all the outfall drains and walking away, allowing the site to do its own thing, was looked at but was rejected, as this would have led to large areas of the center of the moss flooding to quite deep depths where good residual bog vegetation occurred, and in addition, a lot of the higher areas would be left high and dry. So instead, the site has been subject to a sort of managed unit by unit restoration approach. The site is split into 60 management units, and the restoration has been based on working at both the sort of whole site, the water catchment, and then at the unit and subunit level, tailored to the peat cutting pattern, the drainage, and the microtopography. So in essence, just to sum up, it's a bit like trying to put Humpty Dumpty together again, as I hope you can appreciate. So one of the key steps has been to try and tackle the larger drains. Back in the when the land was enclosed in the early 1800s, it was divided up between different land ownerships, and large drains were established. The larger arterial drains created, which are shown as the dark blue lines in this picture, were created during this time to carry large volumes onto, across, and off the site. Trying to restore an improved hydrology has involved trying to re-engineer these in ways that are favourable to peat restoration. So taking number 1 that's shown on the screen, here, progressive land acquisition enabled an arterial drain called the Wixel Manor drain, which was conducting mineral-rich and polluted water right across the centre of the reserve to be diverted back near to the edge of the bog in 2010. Crucially, this then allowed the action number 2 to happen, where we allowed number 2 to occur, which was the re-establishment of the natural catchments by following the creation of a 200-metre peat bund at a strategic location on the site. This allowed the water flows to be directed to the south and to the north. Now, if you then look at the location number 3, where the star is located, in 2011, a fixed weir was installed at the downstream end of the large arterial Fens Moss main drain to raise water levels right across the moss. The level could only be leveled. Sorry, the levels could only be raised so far, because if we raised them too high, they would have flooded the middle of the moss. And then lastly, at number 4, I'll talk about in a minute, Brownington Manor drain has been recently diverted as part of the Bog Life project to the edge of the site. It's worth noting that these are expensive interventions that have been had to be carefully designed and supervised by specialist drainage engineers. They required quite a lot of regulatory approval from the local authority, and often negotiation with any affected landowners, and also require regular sort of ditch maintenance to keep them functional. Also, we often came across species mitigation issues related to things like water voles and badgers. So this is the 4th action I mentioned, the diversion of the Brownington Manor drain. The aim of this scheme is to divert higher nutrient mineral-rich water that cuts across the moss, and to take it back to the edge of the moss. Presence of the enriched nutrient-rich water prevents restoration of the peatland either side. If we did allow that nutrient-rich water to spill over into the adjacent peatland areas, we'd get a sort of more fenny, nutrient-rich type fen community. It's proved a large and complex project. Again, required lots of engineering and careful planning to get sufficient gradient within our own land holding to ensure our neighbours' water could still flow in a way that also safeguards the bog. Our general aim was to try and reroute it back to the edge of the moss, where you would have had where originally you would have had a natural sort of lag stream located, but clearly it's a very artificial version of that. So now the diversion is in place, our aim is to block the old Brownington Manor drain with peat dams, and that will allow us to restore the peatland either side. This slide is just to quickly show you the different types of peat cutting that we have present on site, and that our bunding work, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, has been tailored, and other damming work has been tailored around the types of peat cutting. So our first phase of restoration since 1990 focused on the centre of the moss, so the pink areas, the ex-commercial cutting areas. So in these fairly symmetrical peat cuttings, it's conventional dams, pretty much as Alistair described earlier, were put in place, but they had water pipes installed with the aim of bringing water levels to the surface within 10 centimetres of the surface for most of the year. But the pipes also allow any excess floodwater to be drained away. Despite the great ditch blocking work over the past 25 years, during the first phase, large areas of the moss remained too dry. So as part of the Bog Life project, we have undertaken a lot of peat bunding as well. To do this, we've adopted the technique from the Cumbrian Bog Life project to try and generally create 20 metre by 20 metre cells, or 30 metre by 30 metre cells that effectively hold the rainwater where it falls. Sorry, just have a video here. So as Alistair described, it involves repacking the peat in linear strips to close any root channels or peat pipes, and then using the properties of impermeable permanently saturated peat brought to the surface, which acts to slow the flow of the rain across that surface. So at the heart of the bunds is a sort of 15 centimetre high above the ground level of saturated repacked peat, which is then covered over by the degraded surface peat vegetation. The bunds that we use are generally 40 to 50 centimetres high when completed and 1 metre wide, as I say, with a 15 centimetre high centre of saturated peat, which does most of the holding of the water. Over time, the bunds will subside, we expect. Okay. And this is a picture of an ex-forestry area that was bunded after it was bunded, and it's very effective at holding rainwater that previously shed off the moss quickly. They look like paddy fields initially, but very quickly vegetate over, and the sphagnum moss, etc., establishes quite quickly. So this map shows you, I don't know if you can see the blue and purple areas with the pattern of bunding marked in black. So that's the actual pattern, and a team of 3 or 4 diggers, 7-ton diggers with low ground pressure tracks, have spent 3 to 4 years creating a ring of bunds around the core of the moss, with the aim to support the central area. And so far, 350 hectares have been bunded using this approach, or using contour bunding. Northeast Fens, which is in the northeast part of the site, was an area that had previously been bunded, so that hadn't been bunded or dammed, and the bunding has been very effective in this area. I think it's the pattern of bunding is adapted in each locality to take account of the topography, the local drainage ditches that exist, ground features such as tracks, and in the case of where there's a blue circle, that's a practice bombing range from the Second World War that we ended up bunding around. Another picture of bunding. This is where moss, which I mentioned earlier, and it shows you an example where we've used contour bunding. So the idea of a contour is obviously is we're using the topography, the height of the topography to dictate the line of the bund. And in this case, we have the remnants of one of the domes, southern end of the site, and we wanted to keep this or not bund across this. So we applied a contour approach here. As you can see, the darker areas on this photographs in where you can see the cell pattern, you can see that they indicate the wetness of those areas. And the results are the technique seems to be quite effective. The site is where we've carried out bunding is wetter and is also better for wildlife. Our volunteers have recorded breeding snipe on the bunded areas for the past 2 years, the first records of breeding snipe for 30 years, which is an encouraging sign. There's also water level monitoring evidence from Bettesfield moss, which indicates that bunding is effective at raising water tables. So Bettesfield moss was previously covered in trees. These were removed in 2001, and this stopped 30% of the interception of the rain by the pine trees. But although the few trackside ditches were dammed, the lateral flow through the damaged peats continued, allowing the water tables to drop by up to ½ meter during the summer. If you look at the first red arrow on the left-hand side on the graph, you can see how the water tables fluctuated. But after recent linear cell and contour bunding in 2018 and 19, an analysis by hydrologist Dr. Sam Lever showed this drop no longer happens. Since it's also worth mentioning that since the Fens moss fixed weir, which I showed you earlier, has been installed, she also found that there has been decreasing annual runoff flow peaks occurring from the moss and at much lower magnitudes. So the recent bunding works have further decreased the flow of water leaving the moss. So essentially we're holding more water on the moss for longer. So now coming to talk about the woodland to bog restoration. So conifers have been cleared off from about 100 hectares over the last 20 years off the site. It's worth looking at the dates. So one of what's shown on the screen here shows blocks that have been taken off in 2009, 1998, and 2019. Just worth noting those two blue circles, which mark the location of carbon balance monitoring that was undertaken in 2015, and I'll cover on the next slide. The most recent removal of 50 hectares by the LIFE project in 2019 involved commercial harvesting of trees and brash. And I'll just give you a quick video from an area planted in the 1960s and featuring frequent forestry plough line drains. All the woody material was harvested and utilized to leave a very clean site. The contract placed a requirement for minimum ground disturbance, and brash tracks were limited to arterial routes for the extraction. And these were then removed at the end as far as possible. Prior to Bunding, a further small contract was issued to lower wherever possible the stump heights, as experience has shown that high stumps make restoration more difficult. So now that we've cleared that area off of the trees, in order to bund it, required tree root plates to be lifted by an excavator and moved to the side along the linear bund lines and then pressed into the peat. As a result, the cost of bunding ex-forestry areas is roughly double that of the open peatland. The picture shows the forest areas soon after bunding. Rainfall is being held effectively. This is a huge reversal from when the forest drains kept the water table very depressed. The main post-bunding management issue connected with bunding is the need to control birch tree regeneration along the bund lines, which are obviously higher and drier. So that will be a management consideration going forward. Now, just to briefly mention the research carried out in 2015-16 by Creevy et al. At the locations shown on the previous slide. They looked at the carbon exchange, and their research indicates that approximately after 10 years, ex-forestry areas restored to bog are capable of functioning as carbon sinks, certainly at this location. Their results show that after 17 years, the restored bog was sequestering at a rate that was higher than the uncut, open, most intact areas on the bog. Their findings suggested that establishing a cover of sphagnum moss was a very important factor in getting it towards becoming a better sink. Just a couple more slides to go. So just to finally finish off with a quick overview of the work that we're looking at in terms of the bog edge. An ambitious aspect of the project has been attempting to restore the edges of the bog in close proximity to houses. So on the slide, these are indicated by blue symbols and other land uses. This is particularly challenging with many constraints and brings with it the need to be very precise, carried out in a way that involves every other affected parties and takes account of their interests. And it invariably involves permissions, consents from other authorities, and ultimately quite a few sort of compromises in what you can achieve because of the constraints on the ground. One such area that we've focused on has been on the edge of Wixel Moss, shown here. This area, as you can see, was severed by a canal. The edge of the bog was also the edge of the original bog has been improved for agriculture, but fortunately, over the last 25 years, much of this area has started to become less manageable, less managed. Nevertheless, it's still drained. And in this instance, we also had the added complication of the location of one of the county's largest car breakers yards, which was established on the edge of the bog in the 1960s. So, through the LIFE project, we've managed to fund the purchase of this area. So in green and in purple, this included using our compulsory purchase powers for some areas where we could not prove the ownership. So in the green area, tree removal and ditch blocking and bunding has been undertaken, and the scrapyard, which presented a major contamination risk, has been cleaned up and remediated as part of the LIFE project. Not an ordinary conservation measure, and quite an interesting project. The former agricultural land.
Robert, sorry to interrupt you. Are you coming to an end of your presentation?
Yes, one more slide.
All right, thank you.
Okay. The former agricultural land on peat in the foreground has subsided through peat wastage, and it has poor drainage plus leakage from the canal and is naturally reverting to a wetland. However, the area dries out often in the spring, but the water levels in the drain on the edge of the bog cannot be raised. We're seeking to enhance this area further through the project. So I'll skip that, and I'll just say the last slide here is showing you an area of pasture which we are seeking to revert back to bog on deep peat. The agricultural output on this land is marginal, so the aim is to see if we can quickly re-establish bog vegetation, i.e. sphagnum. So a 3-hectare trial involves turf removal of surface vegetation and breaking the land drains, and then carrying out cell bunding that we've mentioned, with infall and outfall pipes to manage the water levels. Onto the bare peat, propagated sphagnum moss has been planted as small plugs, and we planted a density of 5 per square metre. And finally, straw was applied as a mulch to provide a cover over the summer months to stop the sphagnum drying out. So far, it's early days. We've only carried this out 6 months ago, and the biggest issue we face with this particular aspect of the project has been the flooding of the cells. Thank you for your patience, and this is the end of the presentation.
Thanks a lot, Robert. Very interesting. Maybe Alistair, you can turn on the video as well, your camera. So we go to the questions. There are quite a number of questions in the Q&A. For me, it sounds quite counterintuitive to dig a canal along the edges of the peatland to reverse the water from the peatland to outside of the peatlands, but apparently it works in your situation. So there are a number of remarks from Stefan Corcoran. I hope I pronounce it well. And he has some additional experiences to share. And so maybe Wojtek, could we invite Stefan to give him access to the microphone and camera so he can explain, if Stefan is willing to do so. I don't know.
Yeah, I happily chat. I've got no problems with that.
All right. So Stefan, can you, because you write in the Q&A that you moved away from the technique that was explained by Alistair and using a different approach, a wave dam technique. So maybe you can briefly explain what the difference is between what Alistair described and what your experiences are.
Yeah, I'll happily do that. So I'm Stephen Corcoran, and I work in the Cairngorms, and I'm the sort of program manager for the peatland work in the Cairngorms. So we're using a sort of a combination technique, which is different from what Alistair was doing, which basically removes the entire drain completely. So, and we do that using 2 techniques. So the digger sits across the drain, and it pulls in peat from either side of the drain to form a dam. So it basically does three or four movements with the bucket to create a drain. So there's no excavation, it's just putting material in, and it makes a small dam, and then it moves backwards, and then you taps that down to make a dam, and then it pivots the vegetation from either side of the drain to actually fill in the drain by pulling this vegetation in and compressing it down. So we get the drain completely filled in, and then it moves down the drain doing that, and then builds another dam every 5 meters. We do the dams quite close together because the dams are quite small and straightforward. They're not really big structures, and then the whole drain is completely filled in. And so there's actually no big pools of water. There's no drain to fall into still. So the drain, the void is completely got rid of. And that technique is working really, really well.
Mm-hmm.
So it's quite different from what Alistair's showing. He's building, excavating peat dams at the side of the drain, leaving the drain still there with a dam. But this other technique's a different way of doing it.
All right. So what was the reason you moved to this? You previously used the other technique that was explained by Alistair, or how did you come to this technique?
Yes, we used to do that, but I think we developed it in partnership with one of our contractors, and we just think it's a better technique because we've got rid of the drain. There's no drain left behind.
Yeah.
I could, if there's somewhere to share, I could send round to people some some pictures and a video of some of the techniques of that technique.
Or if you have a website where people could look at and find the information.
Yeah, we don't have a website yet with that on, but that's what we're planning to do. But I do have some links where you could see that. So it is a technique we're now using for all our drains, and we're training all our contractors to do that.
All right.
And the output's still quite good. You can get, the contractors are doing about 300 to 400 meters a day. So you're getting quite good output from doing that drain blocking technique.
All right, thank you. Alistair, would you like to comment on this? Has it been considered also in your situation?
So with the grit blocking, we haven't done any major grit blocking for quite a while, but we personally quite like the pools because it gives it helps basically for us. It's good for insect life. So like most of our area is managed for driven grouse shooting, so that's what they feed the chicks. So it's really, really important for that. And then also it helps spread the birds out when the drinking points become relatively scarce. So it helps with disease control as well from the grouse point of view.
All right. So thank you. And there's another question, but I think you answered that already. Alistair, is Ellen Hopman, who asked, did you use geotextile in the grips to prevent erosion?
No, we don't use geotextiles. No. In other places in England, such as Yorkshire and most of the future, they sometimes use geotextiles. But we personally, we don't. For the grips, they'd be far too small. And then for the Hagrid profiling, we tend, if we can get the angle right, then brash alone is good enough, and that works better than GeoDupe. Yeah.
And there's a question from Anton Gazenbeek. He is wondering how the area, he thinks the area is, the upland bogs are used for grazing by sheep and cattle. And how desirable is that from a conservation point of view, he asked, that farmers continue with this use. Do you have some thoughts about that, Alistair?
it's a complicated question. So North Pennines, like I think grazing will remain, and they are like cattle. Obviously, if it's dominated by millennia in other places, then they can use cattle to naturally break up that millennia and restore the bog. And then for us, sheep grazing, it kind of maintains the number of ticks in the area, and also the tree regeneration and scrub regeneration. So in certain circumstances, we wouldn't want to see kind of scrub vegetation developing on blanket bog in case it dries it out too much.
He sees a kind of contradiction now I notice between the fact that you reduce CO2 emissions by damming the peat and adding methane and NOx into the air by having cattle graze there. Is that
yeah, so we don't control that grazing, so it's that grazing is kind of all part and parcel of
but that counts, of course, for many areas which are have well protected areas where grazing is an important element of the management. And maintaining biodiversity and maintaining grazing can have a kind of opposite effects. Okay, more questions from Paul Vettegaal. At Robert, given the carbon figures, for instance, 131 gram carbon per square meter per year, are they derived of just CO2 fluxes, or was methane taken into account as well? Or losses of water eroded organic carbon too? The latter seemed to be very important, and a very important loss in the Iris Clara bog, which the Eurosite Natural Climate Buffer study tour went recently. So, Robert, do you have some? Do you have an answer to that?
I think so, but I think the best way to answer is to provide a link to the actual paper, and the questioner can refer back to the scientific paper that's produced, which will hopefully answer that question for him. So if I give you a link to the paper, which is online, if that's okay.
Okay, thank you. So Jurate, I think she's from Lithuania, according to her name, she is asking, was sphagnum planting successful? And how are you ensuring optimal water levels? And how much rainfall falls in this area per year? That's, I think, to you, Robert, because you have been. It's
early days, so we're still monitoring the sphagnum plugs, but they seem to be growing well at the moment. And there's another trial of this technique being carried out in the north of England at another bog, and I visited that recently, and it seems to be quite successful. The planting of the sphagnum moss is quite expensive to do, relatively, so it's obviously labor intensive, etc. And I think the other part of the question was how are we how are we controlling water levels? So
how much rainfall?
And how much rainfall? We have about 780 millimeters, and we have had problems with because of climate change, etc. We're getting much more intense rainfall periods. So we have had periods when the sphagnum has been, it's been flooded. So we have control pipes in and out to try and manage the flows, but that has proved quite difficult. Yeah, on another site, which is doing a similar trial, they use a a solar pump to manage the water levels, so they get it just right within 10 centimeters. But that's very artificial, of course.
Mhm. All right, thank you. Yeah. There, I forgot who it was. Was a question to Alistair especially. What drives the distance between the dams? How are you? It seems like the digger is driving around, and it's the decision of the driver of the digger to decide where the dams are coming. But that can be tricky in an area where there are differences in the levels. How
Yeah.
are you doing that?
Yeah, that's right. So approximate approximate areas were marked out for Bunding, but then I think it was just left up, because it was a new technique, it was just left up to the digger drivers to do that. And unfortunately, in some cases, they did, like from the photo, it does look quite staged really and quite uniform. But this was the first time it'd ever been done kind of at that scale really. So I think definitely lessons to be learned there. A good thing about it as well was space. Like I think there was one bund for every 15 square meters. So there was plenty of room around the bund for the digger to move around, and also the land is still used for sheep grazing. So access is still it's still quite accessible across the site.
So that's another question. The excavator did not have a big impact on the vegetation and on the soil.
No, very, very little. Like even in the particularly wet areas, they could travel like surprisingly well. And if they're doing a lot of action in a particular area and the digger starts rocking, that's when you do start getting a bit of impact. But in those sort of areas, the contractors will use bog mats or just to spread the weight around. And bog mats were used when on those big peat buns that had been put in. Bog mats were used on that case because that was quite wet.
And another question for you, Alistair, was also, why is the acrotelm completely missing?
Because of the Industrial Revolution. So it was mainly Industrial Revolution, then overgrazing.
Yeah,
those two. It was, it's probably maybe 20 miles from Manchester. It's got Preston, it's got Blackpool. It's quite close to fairly substantial conurbations.
Thank you. And Tom Johnston, he's asking, do you know what the long-term impact of leaving the birch tree on the bund lines is? And that's mainly to you, I would say, Robert.
Yes, so birch, we are going to manage the birch on the bund lines. So that is one of the consequences of undertaking this technique. So we will prevent the birch trees growing so if they get too tall, the danger is that the roots go into the bund, and if they get blown over, then they could could damage the bund line. So that's one of the aftermath management responsibilities is to manage those. So that's not an insignificant task that we will be undertaking over the years ahead.
Okay, yeah.
The hope is, in time, the hope is that the bunds will subside, and the sphagnum moss and the vegetation will sort of coalesce into and across the bunds. But I think that will take a decade or two in some instances.
Yeah. So another question, and that's for both of you, is relates to the ownership of the area. The Angelica is asking, what is the owner structure of the peatland? Well, you have explained a little bit, but I was also interested, what is the incentive for the owners to contribute to allow that this project is being implemented? Why are they why are they contributing to the restoration projects in both areas, basically? Alistair, maybe you first.
I'm going to go first, yeah. So in terms of the grit blocking, the main incentive is money for the landowners. So they get paid to have these drains blocked up. And in a lot of cases, a lot of the people thought it was a backward step in farming. You know, traditional farm, it's all about drainage. It's all about kind of getting the water away and keeping your livestock fit and healthy. And blocking these drains were a serious kind of a back step in that process. So a lot of the grit blocking was done through agri-environment schemes and being forced to. Now we're moving on to the bare peat. There is a lot of will and a lot of it makes a lot of sense to them. They can see an area turning from black to green or purple, and they can see vegetation starting to come through, because you know the bare peat is soft. They lose sheep in there. It's not good for anything really. And then as we're progressing, things like the Peatland Code, private finance coming in to pay for peatland restoration to gain carbon credits. That's another thing that a lot of landowners in our area are looking into, and we're progressing it with maybe 5 or 6 landowners at the moment that are all interested in utilising the Peatland Code.
Yeah, that's interesting. Would be a nice subject for a following webinar on different experiences on this CO2 codes and peatland codes and CO2 emission payment for CO2 reduction. But Robert, do you have something to add? What is the incentive for the owners in your area to contribute?
Yes, just very quickly, all the land that I showed you, the works going on, is all owned by ourselves. So we haven't. But the main issue has been where what we're doing on our land affects our neighbours. We've had to negotiate with those neighbours to get that agreement, and in 1 or 2 cases we've had legal agreements, and in 1 or 2 cases we're making payments, bespoke payments specific to them. So yes, that's the situation. What we have found is the agri-environment payments that we have available currently are not sufficient to attract landowners in the SAC to fully restore their land. They're not confident, the payments aren't high enough to attract them.
Okay, thank you. So since it is 2:30 now, one last question is from Kees van der Burg, and is what will be the first vegetation in these, especially I think that counts for Alistair's area. Will that be reed or?
No, it'd be either sphagnum moss, like Sphagnum cuspidatum, or common cotton grass. Those are the 2 that start colonising the pools initially.
So no reed encroachment in.
No, it's all upland, so we don't have any reed like that. No.
And Robert?
Yes, again, sphagnum moss, cotton grass. These are the main species.
Yeah. Good. Well, thanks a lot, Alistair. Thanks a lot, Robert.
Thank you.
Also, it's very interesting, very informative also, and at least I learned a lot about what you're doing, and I hope that the participants have learned a lot as well. We will put the webinar on the Eurosite website, and hopefully we will add some additional information, because not all questions could be answered, and there are some questions related to additional information. So I hope we will be able to share them along with the recording of this webinar. so that people can find the information, and they still can also contact you directly to ask questions. So once again, thanks a lot for your participation, and Robert and Alistair for your presentations. And I hope to see you soon back again in another Eurosite webinar. So thanks a lot, and goodbye.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Hank. Thanks, Woodchuck.